Tracing two-dimensional arrays, worksheet number 1. We see that we have a constant here named numRows. It's equal to 3. So anywhere that numRows appears, we can plug in a 3. And anywhere that numColumns appears, we'll plug in the number 2. And we are declaring a two-dimensional array named scores because the two sets of square brackets. And we're instantiating it by pre-populating it with numbers. Instead of writing new int with numbers inside the square brackets, we're telling the computer to put the numbers 100 and 200 in position 0 of the array scores, and so on. 200, 300 would fill in here, and a 100, 100. Now this is just for the human to see, because humans need this visual representation of the array. These are columns, of course, going across the top, and these are rows on this scratch paper grid that I made. This is row 1, for example. This right here is row 2. Over here is column 1 and column 0, etc. Okay, now we proceed with the interesting code here to trace. The variable sum is 0 and row sum is 0. Row avs, that's a one-dimensional array of doubles. So we have 0.0 is currently being stored in each position here. Its length, of course, is 3. The number 3 there means that the positions, the subscripts, are 0 to 2 and not 0 to 3. That would be a common beginner's mistake. Okay, so we're ready to proceed here with the actual double nested for loop that I see. We have a for loop inside of a for loop. The outer for loop iterates the first time. Row is initialized to 0. Is row less than 3? Yes, it is. 0 is less than 3. So we encounter the inside of that outer for loop. We find another for loop, which uses the variable column as its loop variable. Column is less than 2, so we execute this code for the first time. Row sum plus equals. Well, what the heck is this? Scores, row, column. Don't freak out here, because row is simply a variable that you declared, and row is equal to 0 right now. So imagine a 0 being there, and imagine a 0 being there inside that set of square brackets. So really we're asking what value is scores 0, 0 at this moment during this program execution. Well, we come up here to our scratch paper and we see at the intersection of 0 Street and 0 Avenue, we have the number 100. So this is really a 100 right now. And therefore a 100 is being added into the variable row sum. Row sum plus equals 100. Row sum was 0, so it's now 100. We execute this next line of code, so we're putting the number 100 again, arrived at with the same logic, and that 100 is being added also into sum. So sum bumps up to 100. So there we are after the first iteration of that inner loop. We have the number 100 being stored in two different local variables, and we encounter this closing curly brace right here. That closing curly brace tells you to loop back up to its matching top curly brace. Because this is a for loop and we're on the second iteration, we come in from the right side, I like to say. So we're coming in from right here, and we call plus plus. So we add 1 to column. And we come in further from the right side and we inspect this control expression. Is column right now, the number 1, less than the constant numCalls, which is 2? Yes, it is. 1 is less than 2. So we do go through the loop again. This time I'll speed up because we've already been here and done this. But scores row column isn't the 0, 0 that it used to be. We're now looking at position row column, and I see that row is currently 0 still, but column is equal to the number 1. So really we're looking at the value pulled out of this two-dimensional array at the intersection of 0 Street and 1st Avenue. So right here, this is currently the number that we're pulling out. Row 0, column 1. So it's a 200 that we're now plus equaling and adding into row sum. Row sum, let's stay focused here. It's this number one, it was 100. Add the 200 to that, and we have the grand total of 300. We now execute this line of code, which says to take that same number, 200. 200 comes out of the array scores, and it adds into sum, and therefore it's 300. We proceed to iterate the inner for loop again. We column plus plus, coming in from the right side, and we ask, is 2 less than 2? No, it's not. Because this is a big fat false, we do not execute the inner for loop again. We don't iterate through it. And we drop down to this line of code for the first time in this tracing. This line of code, let's pay attention to what it's doing. According to the order of operations, I believe that you execute the typecasting here first before you do the division. Be careful because a lot of students get this wrong. So what is row sum right now? Row sum is 300. By typing the word double there and doing what's called casting or typecasting, we're changing that integer, because after all, row sum is an integer in this program. We're changing it to a double, which essentially means we're adding a decimal place so that we don't lose any decimal numbers with integer division and truncation. So what is 300 divided by 2? Well, it's 150. Technically, it's 150 point or 0.0. And that number is, whoa, where's that going? 150 is plugging into row avs row. Well, what's row avs? Oh yeah, it's an array. It's an array that has zeros in all its positions. And what's row right now? Well, I see that row is 0. You really, really, really have to keep track of your tracing very accurately. Do not do any of this stuff in your head. I'm not smart enough to do this in my head. I don't even think Einstein is smart enough to do this in his head. Nobody is above doing this kind of tracing on the AP exam. So we have a 150, and we're plugging it into row avs position 0, which you see is this number right here. It's now overwritten with the number 150. And if you want to be perfect, you would put a little point there showing that it's a decimal number and not a whole number. The next line of code, very boring, row sum equals 0. Oh, I see what they're doing. They're resetting row sum so that each time we add up a row here and find the sum of the row, we reset our variable that's being used to keep track of the total of the next row. This total is going to be 500, but if you did not reset row sum equal to 0 here, you would end up with 300 from this guy plus 500 from this guy for a total of 800, which is illogical and would mess up your bowling statistics if these were bowling scores or something like this. So you got to be accurate, and you have to know to reset the row sum at the right time. Well, we hit this curly brace right here, which loops us back up to this outer for loop, in which case we come in from the right side and we row plus plus. I'm going to erase all this scratch work to sort of show you where we've come all this way. We started with the outer for loop, and we encountered the inner for loop and iterated it 3 times. And now we're going back to the outer loop, and we're plus-plussing. We're pretty much right here, getting ready to add up 200 plus 300. We don't know this 500 yet. Well, it's kind of tricky, but now that we've row plus-plussed and bumped row up to 1, and checked to make sure that 1 is indeed less than 3, which it is, we get to this line of code now for the second time, for the umpteenth time in this tracing. This line of code executes all over again as if we've never been here before. That's just the way Java and all computer languages work when you double nest for loops. So, int column equals 0. This declaration initialization statement acts as if it had never been encountered before. In fact, column was out of scope there for a while, and it didn't exist for a short amount of time. And column is coming back to life, and it's being set equal to 0. And 0 is less than 2. So we go through the body of this inner for loop again. Wow, I've been here, done this 3 times, so now I have to do it again. What is row and column right now at this point in the program? Well, row is equal to 1. Column is currently reset back to 0. And what that means is that I come up here to the array named scores, and I find the intersection of 1 street and 0 avenue. Okay, row 1 and 0 column. This number right here, 200. That's very different from the number 0, 1. 1, 0 is very different from 0, 1. It's always row first, then column. And right now it's 1, 0. So we're pulling out that 200 here. The 200, of course, gets added into row sum with the plus equals. And row sum was 0, and now it's bumped up to 200. That's nice. And now we execute the line of code sum plus equals. Well, trust me, that's the same 200 here that we had on the line before it. So that 200 is now being added into sum. Oh, I see. That 200 added in there, so that's the grand total. Sum is the grand total of all these numbers in the two-dimensional array being added up. Row sum is just the sum of the running total of each individual row. This program is like a 2-for-1 special. It's doing 2 things. It's adding up each row and dumping those totals somewhere or making use of them somehow, but it's also adding up the grand total. Okay, I just added 200 in there. I loop back up to the top of the for loop, column plus pluses, so columns up to 1. We now carefully execute these 2 assignment statements right here, keeping our eye focused on the row and column index variables. Row is currently 1. Column is now 1. And so what value lives at the intersection of 1 street and 1 avenue? Oh, the number 300, a perfect game in bowling. That 300 adds into row sum. The next line of code causes that 300 to be added into sum. These columns don't have to match up in any way, shape, or form. Some columns will be short, some columns will be long. It all depends on the nature of that code segment. I column plus plus up to 2. 2 is not less than 2. So we're done executing and iterating that inner for loop. We come down here to row avs equals blah, blah, blah. Row sum right now is 300. 300 divided by 2 is 150. So we're putting a 150 here. Something doesn't make sense about this. Oh, that should have been 500. I'm sorry, I added 300 to 200, and I should have gotten 500 here. So it's really a 500 divided by 2 at this point, which is 250, of course, 250.0 if you want to be exact. And we reset row sum back to 0 for a whole nother go around. Well, I'm not going to continue this. Just trust me that you're not allowed to do this, but I am, to make this video shorter. So the next time that this inner for loop, well, row plus plus is up to 2. 2 is indeed less than 3. So the computer encounters this inner for loop as if it had never been here before. It resets, row sum is already reset, and it adds in the 100. See this? It adds 100 here. It adds the other 100 that you see in that position to this. And that 100 adds there. By the way, column has already done this number, I believe. And crossing out all these old values so I don't get confused. Finally, we end up row plus plusing for another go around of the outer loop. Well, when row plus pluses to 3, 3 is not less than 3. So finally we have a false on this outer for loop, which means we don't go into that loop again. Therefore, we don't ever encounter this inner for loop ever again, and we're basically done tracing all of this code right here. Done. We're out of here. We drop down to this line of code. Oh, nasty stuff. Could have been done in short, choppier assignment statements, but let's follow the order of operations and make sure we get this right. I see an outer set of parentheses there, and we're taking scores, square brackets 0.length times scores.length. Very interesting. This is legal. Follow along. Scores.length, that's easy. The length of this array scores is 3. Because that array is really a one-dimensional array of length 3. See how I'm boxing that off? And this is position 0, position 1, and position 2. Its overall length is 3, therefore. So this is a 3 right here. I explained this much more thoroughly in my lecture notes. Now this part of it. What is scores square brackets 0? Not scores square brackets 0 square brackets something else, but just scores square brackets 0. Well, that is this right here. This is scores square brackets 0. And that is really an array that's inside of the outer array. So what's the length of that array right there? Well, you can count them with me. 1, 2. The length is 2. That 100 there is in position 0, and that 200 is in position 1. But the length is 2. So this, folks, right here, this part of it, that's really the number 2 at this moment. And 2 times 3 is 6. So we're dividing something by 6. What are we dividing by 6? Whatever sum is. Sum at this point is 1,000. But because of the typecasting with the double, it's really 1,000.0. And 1,000.0 divided by 6, on the AP exam you cannot use a calculator, so you'll have to do long division just like I'm doing it right here because I can't do this in my head. And check my work, but I get 166.66666 repeating. And Java chops that off at some point, something like the 6th or 7th decimal place usually. It doesn't really matter. The AP exam won't require you to know that. So and it does not round for you. It'll be 166.6 or so. And so average is being assigned that value, and I'm just going to make it 166.6 repeating. Now, if you go and test this on the computer, it's going to show you where that rounding happens, and I don't even know that myself. So if you have an answer on your worksheet when I grade this that is exactly something like 166.667, I'll know that you typed all this code in and cheated by executing it in a compiler. For the purposes of watching this whole video and getting to the bitter end here after 18 minutes, that is your extra credit right there, to know that the answer that I want on my worksheet is 166.6 with a bar over it. And then this little guy right here, this for loop. I didn't use curly braces for some reason, but it still works. We are iterating through the array named row_avs. We're going using I, and we're going one by one with a plus plus. We're going out to row_avs.length. So you guessed it, because of the print ln, on each different line of the output, we are taking these numbers right here. And this number right here ends up being a 100. I'd never traced out the code. So we end up getting the numbers 150, 250, and 100. I'm not sure if the decimal points print out or not. I don't really care. But those are the numbers that print out because of this system out print statement inside of this for loop right here. Whatever happened to average? Well, it never printed out. We didn't do a system out print of av. So you should just have this number circled right here to show that that's the final value that's stored in the variable av. And while we're at it, let's circle our final values that you should have. Row sum actually ends up resetting to 0. It does reset back to 0 again on that last loop iteration. Column ends up being a 2 at some point, and the variable row, it ends up being a 3 when the outer for loop kicks out. So there are your answers: 3, 2, 1000, 0, 166.6 repeating, and then this is your little output window that you would show me so that I know that you know what this program prints out.